The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Life is filled with highs and lows, valleys and mountaintops. When we are on mountaintops, it feels like we can take on the world. But when we are walking through a valley, it can lead us to despair, not only for the situation we are in, but as we look up to the mountaintops, it reminds us of where we could be. What do we do when we are walking through the valley?
Whether in the natural realm or in the spiritual ones, valleys can be very, very daunting places. And I know for me, a valley in my life, or even a valley amongst hills and mountaintops, can so much remind me of how small that I am. See, whether we're next to a tall mountain or being overwhelmed by a life circumstance, valleys have a way of putting me in my place. And even worse, as I look up at the hills around me, and I see the loftier places, the places that are higher, the places where I want to be, where my life could be, it just reminds me of how far away from the mountaintops that I am and how much further I have to go. And then I'm presented with the challenge. When I look up at those hilltops, when I look up at those mountaintops, and I become discouraged about how far away I am from where I want to be, will I look up and take it as a challenge to allow God to get me to loftier places? Or will I allow it to overwhelm me and discourage me? See, if I choose to allow Jesus to take me to the loftier places, I can look at the valley so much differently than I ever had before. I can see the valley as a part of the journey that Jesus has me on, the place where Jesus walks with me and brings me the comfort that I so desperately need, so that I can begin the hard walk upward to the lofty, higher places. You know what? All of us, we look for rescue in all sorts of places, don't we? When walking through a tough situation, when walking through a valley, we are looking for rescue. We're looking for someone to lead us out of it. And maybe for you today, it's a job. Maybe it's a relationship valley that you're walking in, or a circumstance that you're looking at and you just want to get out of. We think if only I had this, then I could get out of this valley. But the problem is that we've tried and it just isn't working. I think you know what I mean. So in this session today, I want us to take a look at the best approach to walking through a valley. Let's do that together here today. As with the entire psalm, yet again, the shepherd is the focus of this passage. It's his very presence that brings peace to the sheep. In this verse here, Psalm 23:4, we get a closer look at the protective aspect of the shepherd. The shepherd is truly someone who is rugged and watchful and protective and ready to act. Like it says there in Psalm 23:4, it says this, it says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." I don't know about you, but that's one of my favorite parts of this entire psalm, is to know that I have protection. And as we've just read, we see that because the shepherd is so protective and he's so proactive, that the sheep, well, they're not afraid. Because they know that he will react, that he will protect them, that he'll be proactive. Even when they don't even know that they are in danger, he will come and protect them. Aren't you glad that our shepherd Jesus, who really, if you think about it, this entire psalm is all about, aren't you so glad that Jesus is so protective and caring about us? That he doesn't forsake us. He doesn't give up on us. He walks right along beside us. In Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5, we're reminded of this. It says, keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have because God has said this, never will I leave you and never will I forsake you. That's one of the most glorious verses, I think, in the entire Bible. I mean, isn't it amazing that we have a shepherd, Jesus, who is so caring about us? But what can happen, though, is that sometimes, well, we might want the shepherd. We might want what the shepherd gives to us. We want the protection and safety that he provides. But yet, isn't it so funny that we often can drift away from him? See, it's very easy for us to neglect spending time with the shepherd because we neglect time with him because at the same time, though, we want everything that he has to offer. We neglect spending time with him, but we still want what he has to give us. We still want the peace and the security and the salvation that he offers us. But what can happen when we walk through a valley? As we walk along, Jesus may not take us through the valley in the quickest way to get us out of it. And so we might get a little impatient. As we look up at the hilltops and the mountaintops, we wish that we were already on. What do? We break away from the shepherd. We break away from Jesus, and we try to get up there quicker. But sadly, what is quickest is often not the best. No way. You know, maybe we think that we could just get a better job if we would just be a little dishonest, when instead, it might take a little longer to do it the right way, to walk the right journey with Jesus to get you there. And in the end, it can destroy everything. You could even lose your job, right? You know, even in marriage, it might be harder to take the safer route because of abstinence before marriage. We're supposed to wait until we're married to engage in sexual activity. So what do? We climb up on our own, up these cliffs. And they often have such disastrous results. And maybe if you're a student, you're at school, it can be really hard to walk with Jesus. It can be hard to walk with Jesus in the school hallways with truth and honesty and love. And so it's just easier, it's just faster to climb the steep cliffs of backstabbing and lies and fitting in with everyone else. And again, those often come with such horrible consequences. See, how we walk through the valley says a lot about how good a mountaintop is. When we reach the mountaintop, how did we get there? See, if we try the easy route, well, the easy route is almost always going to come with steep consequences. And you know what? If you think about it, it's an even harder fall into the valley that we just came out of. Now, maybe for you, when you think of mountaintops, as you're walking through the valley and you look up at the mountaintops, the hilltops, you see from the valley places that you really wish you could get to, but they just seem so insurmountable. They seem like obstacles that you just can't overcome, and you can only wish that you could get there. Perhaps that mountaintop for you can represent the future. Maybe right now to you, your future looks perilous. It's exhausting. It's impossible. You know what? I'll say it most times they are. Our future and what we have ahead of us isn't always the easiest, which is why we need Jesus all the more. See, Jesus teaches us in Luke chapter 12, verses 5 through 8. He says, I tell you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, and after that can do no more. But I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him, he's speaking of God, his Father. Fear him who after the killing of the body has power to throw you into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Jesus says there, yet not one of them is forgotten by God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So, don't be afraid. You are worth more than many, many sparrows. And in verse 8 he says, I tell you, whoever acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man will also acknowledge him before the angels The angels of God. See, maybe we have our fears in the wrong places. We worry so much about what's around us. Instead, let's look to God. You know, something else too about valleys is that they can often provide cover for evil. When you're walking through a valley, it can be overgrown, kind of like this, and evil has a way of hiding in places we don't expect. And it can make it so much easier when it's hiding in those places to attack us, to ambush us. And so when we're walking through a valley, we need protection all the more. When you're up on a hill or a mountaintop, you can look down and see everything. But when you're walking through the valley, you need protection, and that is who the shepherd is. He is there to protect us, to walk through this with us. The rod and the staff that are depicted here in verse 4 are the ones that a shepherd would use during the time of David to defend sheep from attack, as well as to draw the sheep back to safety. It was used to protect, but also to guide. And you know what? Jesus leads us. He leads the flock, and He defends it. The same Lord who shepherds us through life will even shepherd us through death. Even as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, He will shepherd us. And we can learn from all of this, that we can walk boldly through life because Jesus has walked through death for us. He knows what death is, and He can walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and He knows that there's something on the other side. But there's something else here about the rod and the staff, is that while the rod was used to club violent animals when they would attack the sheep, the staff was also used to count the sheep when they were led back to their pen. As the sheep would come back into their pen, the shepherd would often use the staff to count. And this gives us a very personal connection. It teaches us that each sheep matters to the shepherd. You know, what's really interesting here about verse 4 is and it's really something you could easily miss, is as you look at the entire psalm, in the first 3 verses, we see the pronoun He is used. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He. We see that over and over. But here in verse 4, He doesn't say He anymore. It changes to you. Why is that important? Because it's a personal connection. See, this passage also speaks about the shadows that are in the valley. We have this personal connection, but even when we run in the shadows that can be dark and foreboding, giving us really just an outline, not even a full picture of what is around us, it can be a scary place to be. But Jesus, when He's walking with us, we don't have to be afraid. In verse 4, it gives the sense of the most fearful darkness when we read about shadows here. And for each of us, that darkness, that shadow can differ. But for all of us, these shadows exist. Maybe for you, it's the shadow of death itself. Maybe it's a broken relationship. Maybe it's financial hardship. Perhaps it's just the unknown. But as we know, and we learned when we were younger, is that shadows cannot hurt us. And Jesus, well, He's not afraid to walk in the shadows. See, this valley that the shepherd is leading the sheep through seems to be one in which only the shepherd, only Jesus could bring us through. Now, God takes no pleasure in watching us go through valleys of death. He takes no pleasure in that. He doesn't take pleasure in watching people die. That's outside of His plan. But God will take, what did He do? He decided instead to step into this world. And He decided to give us a way out of the valley, a path through the valley. And that's why the resurrection that we learn of in the New Testament, in the gospel of Jesus, is so important, because it's God's answer to getting us out of the ultimate valley of the shadow of death. See, again, Jesus, again, walked through death to give us life. And He will lead us as we walk through life, and then we pass into death, that again, He too will give us life. As we look at Psalm 23:4, we find that the main idea, the main point that David is sharing with us here in at least this verse, and really the entire psalm, is that danger lurks in valleys without the right protection. And so with this main point, with this main idea in mind, it leads me to asking you a few questions. The first one is this one. Is if danger lurks, then why do you look to the hills? If danger's around you, why are we so busy looking up to the hills, to the mountaintops, the places where we want to be instead of the place that we're in? When I was in the Cascade Mountain years ago in Washington State, what really struck me and surprised me with being a guy that wasn't really around mountains a whole lot was that when I went to Mount Rainier, the largest of the Cascade Mountains, that it's not the only mountain, that there are other mountains around us. Now, of course, those hilltops, those mountaintops aren't as big as Mount Rainier, but there are mountains all around. You know what, in life, when we stand in a valley, it can be really easy to just want to get up to the closest mountaintop that we see, the one that is the closest to us, maybe the next job opportunity, the next pay raise, the next good grade on a paper at school or a test at school or retirement. And I would call these things false peaks. They're peaks that we want to get to, but when we get there, maybe we realize, See, the problem is that when we get to the top on one of these false peaks, we see that there are bigger ones. It's like what happened to me when I went to Mount Rainier. I got to one smaller mountain and thought, wow, and then there's another one and a bigger one. See, the view in the valley wouldn't be so bad if we would just focus more, if we just remembered that we are walking with our shepherd, Jesus Christ. See, the shepherd, he wants to protect us from a lot of the dangers that lurk around us in the middle of a valley, and one of the dangers is being discontent. See, getting out of the valley is not really the answer. We might think, if only I got out of this valley and got to a mountaintop, my life would be better. But here's the problem. When you get to that mountaintop, guess what's on the other side? That's right. It's another valley. Just because you get to the top doesn't mean that you're going to stay there. Well, here's another question I would ask you. So, not just why are we busy looking up at the mountaintops and the hilltops? Here's the next question. If danger lurks, why do you try to go it alone? When you're walking through the valley where an evil has all these places to hide, why are you trying to do that alone? See, valleys are places where evil lurks because it can disguise itself. It can hide, like in the weeds that are here around me. And those enemies, those dangers can attack us from unexpected places. One of the dangers that often pops out when we're in a valley is that of discontentment. It's easy to turn to those mountains and say, if only I had that. And the problem is when we do that, we're turning it into a god. And it can lead you to all kinds of places. It can lead you to looking for someone else outside of your marriage. It can lead you to thinking that you can find happiness and joy and peace in someone else or something else outside of God. You know, it's really, really easy to get snatched by these things. When you go on your own, when you are exposed and by yourself in the valley where danger lurks, it's so easy to get snatched up, and that's why it is so important to be a part of a larger flock, and in our case, to be a part of the church. I think it's so important, it's so essential. And it also explains to me why there are so many Christians that I'm afraid have gotten snatched up by the world, and they're following the world's ways because they have left the flock. They want what Jesus has to offer, but they don't really want Jesus. Now, for some of you today, as I mentioned earlier, maybe the fear isn't so much about getting out of the valley, it's that you can't even get to the mountaintop. You're afraid of what the future might hold. You might not think that you can climb the heights and rise from the valley that you're walking in. And so, maybe you've tried for a while and you've realized that you can and that you just want to give up. See, again, if those valleys are so big and you're so afraid, they can become false peaks too. We could worship them, this fear that overwhelms us. And that leads me to our final question. If danger lurks, why not focus on who walks with you? You know, don't focus so much on the hilltop and don't focus so much on the valley, but focus on the one you're with. You know, I can remember when I was young, my dad one time, he took me to hang out with him at work. I thought it was really cool. I was 5 or 6 years old, and he took me to this large federal building that he was the building manager of. It was about 15 stories high. And when he was done with work that day, he said, "Hey, let's go up on the roof." Well, I was a little scared about that, but I followed him, and we went up the stairs, and we got on the roof, and of course there was a lot of other large buildings around me, and then he said, hey, why don't you look down at the streets? And I was so scared to death about getting on the edge of that roof and looking down that I grabbed onto my dad, and I just would not let him go. See, I didn't want to focus on the danger that lurked around me on that rooftop, and I wanted to focus on my Father who was there to protect me. And just like we looked at last week, when we walk on paths and we walk through valleys, we can either be tempted to look too much at that path or too much at that valley, or even focus too much on the rising mountains that are around that valley, when maybe instead what we should be doing is we should look at the shepherd who is going to bring us home. The shepherd who will protect us from ourselves, and he will protect us. He will protect us from others, but we have to hold on to him. We have to hold on to him. Now remember, what protection is to us, though, might be a little bit different than what it is to God. Yes, we're still going to walk through dangerous places. We're still going to walk through deep valleys filled with the shadows of death. We still will walk on paths that take us to dark places, but we can hold hope. We can have joy that Jesus will lead us home. See, going it alone is always the worst way to go. And then to go through life alone without Jesus, if you ask me, it's just a little insane, because we can't do it on our own. Just look at the world around us. We can't do it on our own. And so here's my challenge for all of us. And I'm going to shape it in a question for you. But here is our challenge this week as we look at our lives. What mountains have you taken your eyes off of the shepherd to? What mountains around you have you focused so much on that it's taken your eyes off of the shepherd? What next thing has attracted your attention and distracted you from the shepherd Jesus? Maybe you've been distracted by getting ahead at work. Maybe trying to get to that next mountaintop. Maybe it's distracted you and you've taken your eyes off the shepherd. Maybe you've been distracted because you've been striving to have that next experience or that next thing with your family, and it's taken your eyes off of Jesus. Maybe you've been trying to be popular at school, and it's been driving you more and more, and all along, while you're climbing the jagged edges up that steep cliff out of the valley, up to that mountaintop that looks so good, what's happening is you're getting farther and farther away from Jesus as he stands in the valley. Isn't it ironic that we would do that? You know, maybe that can explain a little bit about why we're often so filled with anxiety and fear. You know what? You might have all that you want, but you know what? You're nowhere near having it all if you don't have Jesus. A few weeks ago, someone at our church shared with me a book that's called Journeys with the Messiah. And the book it's of pictures that are taken of Jesus standing with various people in today's context. Now, many of the pictures are Jesus walking through valleys of people's lives, different circumstances that they're walking through that are just filled with darkness and with shadows, just like our lives in many cases. But you know, in the photos, there's one photo of Jesus sitting on some steps with a man who has lost his job, showing that Jesus would walk with him in that dangerous financial period of his life. Even when the man was exposed financially, that Jesus would stand there and be there with him, that Jesus would protect him from the darkness. You know, there's another picture that's in that book, another photo that shows Jesus with a wheelbarrow. And it's kind of a different picture. Here it is. You'll see it on the screen. He's with a wheelbarrow with a tight line that's stretched out across a valley, and asking if you will get into that wheelbarrow as he pushes you along. And perhaps you're at the edge of that. And you know what? Jesus wants to invite you to let him get you across. I want to ask you today, I want to ask you this. What would happen? What would happen in your life if you decided right here, if you decided right now that no valley in your life is so dark that you aren't protected, that you have what you need to be protected, that even if cancer shows up, even if divorce arrives into your life, even if job loss happens, that you are still protected and that you can still live joy with peace and happiness? What if we really accepted this? What would happen? I really do believe we'd find what joy is. We wouldn't be afraid of the valleys anymore because we know that we are not exposed, but rather that Jesus, that He's there to protect us. And so that is my prayer to you, is that you would give your life to Jesus and that you would know that He wants to give you protection as you walk through the valley.